Chapter 1158. Li Xian always appeared when he was least supposed to. For the sake of Xiao Rui, Li Yi didn't argue with him for the time being. Xiao Rui and Li Duan hadn't seen each other for more than 5 years. She was so excited that she couldn't speak. Li Yi and Li Xian walked into the room, giving them some time to be alone. So that Mu Zi is you. Li Xian looked him up and down and said, Mu Zi Li, no wonder Xianning lost to you on purpose. Why didn't I think of that at that time? Li Xian had enough IQ, but he was extremely lacking in EQ. A person who was always thinking of pushing the throne to someone else was definitely not normal. Li Xian had a look of disdain. I didn't expect you to be such a beast. You even had ideas about Xianning. Tell me honestly, did you have ideas about her the first time you saw her? If I remember correctly, she was only 11 years old at that time. The first time Li Yi saw Xianning was in the 2nd year of Jinghe. At that time she was still at Sundara. At that time he didn't even have ideas about Emingzu. At that time he wasn't so beastly. Even now the 18-year-old Xianning was just a big kid in his eyes. She was different from Emingzu and the others. Li Yi cracked his knuckles and said, Do you believe that I won't even have ideas about you when I'm beastly? Li Xian knew that no matter how beastly Li Yi was, he wouldn't have ideas about him. But when he was beastly he would hit him. He looked around and changed the topic. Miss Lu and the others haven't come back? Li Yi shook his head. No. Li Xian thought for a moment and asked, So you'll leave again? Li Yi thought for a moment and said, I'll leave after the new year. What about Xianning? Take her away. What about Emingzu? Take her away too. If you all leave, what about me? Li Xian had just sat down when he suddenly stood up and asked, If you take Emingzu away, what about the imperial court and the Jing kingdom? When Li Xian said this, he sounded very righteous and confident. When he was completely shameless, Li Yi actually had nothing to say in response. Li Yi sighed and said, You can still pass the throne to Li Han. Li Xian also let out a long sigh and said, Little Han has become smarter these past few years. It's not easy to trick him anymore. Emingzu will not leave. He looked at Li Yi and said, You won't leave her here alone. Why don't you return to the capital? If anyone dares to object, I'll chop off his head. What did he mean by Mingzhu wouldn't leave? If he hadn't appeared at the wrong time and interrupted Mingzhu, who knew what would have happened? The capital is too small. Li Yi looked at him and said, Only when you leave the capital, leave the Jing kingdom, will you know how big this world really is? Seeing the strange light flashing in Li Xian's eyes again, Li Yi knew that he shouldn't have said this. It was fine to abduct the princess, but abducting the emperor would cause him to be condemned and reviled by thousands of people. However, he would not stay in the capital for long. If he stayed here for too long, he wouldn't be able to find Rui. Li Xian looked at him, thought for a moment and suddenly asked, Your little martial nephew is about to sit on the throne of the Wu kingdom. Don't you want to have 2 empresses? Li Xian's suggestion was very tempting, but his motive was not pure. Yang Liuqing became the empress for a better future of the Wu kingdom. Emingzu became the secret empress of the Jing kingdom because Li Xian couldn't help her. What did he mean by having 2 empresses? Did it have anything to do with him? In the room, both of them became silent. Everyone had a side that was not known to others. Some people looked beautiful on the surface, but secretly looked at Peppa Pig. Li Xian was actually very pitiful. On the surface, he was the emperor of the Jing kingdom, above thousands of people, and the most powerful man on this continent. However, what he was interested in was not the throne, nor was it power. From the beginning, there were only 2 stones of different sizes. Outside the room in the yard, Li Duan covered his ears and said hurriedly, Xiao Rui, I was wrong. The little girl put one hand on her waist and pulled his ear with the other hand. She said angrily, What did you do wrong? Li Duan said softly, I was wrong that I didn't recognize you that day. The little girl originally thought that he was going to talk about how he used those words to anger her that day. Hearing him say that, her grip became even lighter. She said in a low voice, Then I also didn't recognize you. It's my fault. Li Duan said hurriedly, It's been too long. I've grown up. Of course you can't recognize me. You're not wrong, it's all my fault. But you still can't bully girls? I didn't know it was you at that time. I will never bully you. The little girl's hand changed from pinching to caressing. She asked softly, Does it hurt? Li Duan shook his head and said with a silly smile, It doesn't hurt. It really didn't hurt. It was much lighter than when his aunt spanked his butt. The relationship between Li Duan and Xiao Rui was established when the 2 of them could not crawl. It had not been diluted by the passage of time. When Li Yi walked out of the room, the 2 of them were chatting and laughing as they played on the swing. Without disturbing them, He walked out of the estate and headed in the direction of the imperial palace. He had been interrupted by Li Xian earlier, so he and Emingzu had not finished talking. He was also very curious about what else he had said to her that time when he was drunk. Morning Dew Palace. Emingzu took off her phoenix coronet and changed into casual clothes. She said, "Come take a walk with me." Ever since Li Xian had moved into Hibiscus Garden, the already spacious imperial palace had become much emptier. There were no guards in the enormous imperial garden. It was already winter, but the capital always snowed late. In the imperial garden, fallen leaves covered the ground, making it bleak and desolate. After a moment of silence, Li Yi turned his head to look at her and asked, "What was that last sentence?" Mingzhu's footsteps paused. She pointed to an empty space in front of them and said, "Beat me and I'll tell you." A few years ago, of course, Li Yi would not have agreed to this request of hers. But now it was different. Although Emingzu had not stagnated in the past few years, he had made much faster progress. He could not beat Rui or a grandmaster, but Emingzu, he was no longer the jianghu of Silla that she could bully at will. Li Yi smiled and nodded. Okay. Li Yi did not seem to practice diligently, but the tortoise breathing skill that he had learned from second great uncle was practiced 24 hours a day. The grandmasters around him were Rui, Chang, Su and Elder Tian. From time to time he would also communicate with second great uncle. In this life he would never be able to make a comeback under Rui. But Emingzu? When they first met he was chased by her. Later he was suppressed by her. Today it was finally time for him to fight back. After Jianghu of Silla and the princess entered the imperial garden, it became a forbidden area. Emingzu walked to the empty space first. She took off her coat and put it aside. For the first time, Li Yi realized that he was not the person he was 5 years ago. Emingzu was also not the Emingzu of 5 years ago. She just hadn't met her fated chance. When she became a grandmaster, Rui and her would have to compete to know who would win. While he was distracted, a strong wind came from the front. Li Yi moved his body and raised his palm to meet it. 2 hours later. Li Yi's clothes were all soaked, but he won after all. He pressed Emingzu on his lap and panted slightly. He asked, "Do you surrender?" Mingzhu's hair stuck to her face. She looked a little embarrassed. She said with a red face, "Let me go. You even wrote a letter to Rui to beat me?" Li Yi looked at her and sneered. "When you asked her to spank me, did you ever think that you would have this day?" She struggled for a while, but Li Yi had sealed her acupoints. She couldn't exert any strength at all. Li Yi slapped a certain part of her body and said, "In the martial world there are some debts that must be paid. Rui hit me 18 times that time. I remember every one of them. At that time I thought that one day I will pay you back 18 times, one by one. This was a once-in-a-blue-moon opportunity and he might not come across it again in the future." Li Yi's slap landed, and his face revealed an expression of revenge. Emingzu lay on his lap. After a moment of silence she said, You said that if I got tired of this life I would go to you and you would marry me." Li Yi couldn't slap her anymore. "Really?" He looked at her with some suspicion. He had guessed it right. She wanted to cheat him into marrying her when he was drunk and didn't remember what had happened. "It's fake." She struggled to get up and looked at Li Yi. She asked, "If it's fake, will you still marry me?" Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "Yes." After saying the word yes, he was stunned for a moment. Maybe for 2 seconds. Then he quickly got up from the ground and ran outside. Chapter 1159. The world is really unfair. Li Yi sensed the malice from the chants. He taught Tai Chi to Rui and Rui became a guru. He kissed Mississippi Lu and Rui also became a guru. He could understand these two ways of breaking through. Rui had accumulated a lot of experience, and she was enlightened because of Taiji. Rui had been thinking about him for a long time, and now that she had gotten what she wanted, it was not difficult for her to figure it out. But what happened to Emingzu? I only spanked her 10 times. Why did she also become a guru? Did I accidentally open up her conception and governing vessels and let her become a guru in an instant? Maybe he could ask Lu Luo to put up more advertisements in the martial arts world. I have rich experience in assisting, and I am a professional in giving chances to help people become guru. Only available to women and 20% off for group purchases. For more information, please go to Rui City. The address is. He had just taught Mingzhu the principle that he had to pay for what he had done. Now Emingzu was teaching him the truth again. When Li Yi faced a grandmaster, it was not that he could not fight back. But Rui and Emingzu had been stuck at a critical point for many years. All they needed was a kiss and a few pats. So once they made the breakthrough, they could already suppress ordinary gurus. Of course, it was like playing with him. Now she was lying on top of him. To be exact, she was riding on top of him. Run. Why don't you run? Mingzhu looked down at him from above and said expressionlessly, just like 5 years ago, you can run. Li Yi sighed and grabbed her hand. With a little force, she lay on the grass with him. A long time ago, when the academy was just built, the two of them used to lie on the grass by the lake for 2 hours. Of course, at that time they lay separately. No. Li Yi put his arm around her shoulder and said, I will take you with me. She lay on Li Yi's arm and suddenly asked, how far are you and Rui now? What do you mean? Did you hug her? Li Yi nodded. Did you kiss her? Li Yi nodded again. And then? Nothing. Li Yi shook his head. She turned her body, looked at him and kissed him. Her lips parted on Li Yi's face and said, now we are the same. No. Li Yi shook his head and said, she kissed on the lips. She hesitated for a moment and this time, Li Yi felt a soft touch on his lips. However, time passed even faster and before he could feel it, it had already disappeared. You even stuck out your tongue? This time, Li Yi didn't wait for her to kiss him and took the initiative to kiss her. 2 hours. What were you two doing inside? Li Xian stood outside the imperial garden for 2 hours. His feet were numb. He knew that Li Yi and Mingzhu had gone inside, so he did not go in to disturb them. However, he did not expect that they did not go in for a walk. They actually stayed inside for 2 hours, and Mingzhu, who always paid attention to her appearance, had messy hair. Li Yi was even more embarrassed. Even his clothes were torn and there were a few strands of grass in his hair. These evidence were enough to prove that they had just had an intense and long exercise on the grass. This was a bit too long. Li Yi had seen Li Xian 3 times today. Fortunately, he finally had some vision for the last time and did not directly barge in like he did in the morning. He looked at Li Yi and Mingzhu and said solemnly, I have something important to tell you too. When the usually frivolous Li Xian spoke to them with such an expression, it meant that he really had something important to tell them. Mingzhu nodded and said, let's go back and talk. Morning Dew Hall. Li Xian looked at the two solemnly and asked, you two are leaving? Mingzhu looked at him and then nodded. Li Xian let out a long sigh and said, I don't want to be the emperor. Li Xian had never wanted to be the emperor. So Li Yi and Mingzhu both looked at him and waited for his explanation. You both know that I am not cut out to be the emperor. Li Xian looked at them and said, Mingzhu has left. I can't handle the matters of the court. Li Yi nodded and said, we know. Li Xian sighed and said, I know that Mingzhu has her own life and her own happiness. I don't have the power and I don't want to hold her back. But I don't want to be the emperor. Actually, being the emperor isn't that difficult. Below the emperor, there are still the prime minister and all the civil and military officials in the court. You don't have to decide everything big or small. Li Yi looked at him and said, you might as well hurry up and have a son with the empress and imperial concubine. When he grows up, you can pass the throne to him. Since ancient times, when the situation of a country stabilized, the emperor could be a mascot. As long as he didn't make any big mistakes, he only needed to supervise the officials and the country would continue to run smoothly. Speaking of this matter, the expression on Li Xian's face became even more sorrowful. He had already given birth to 3 children, 2 for the empress and 1 for imperial concubine. But all 3 of them were daughters. Perhaps he really didn't have the same fate as Li Yi. I might not be able to make it. If Qin'er's pregnancy this time is a daughter. He suddenly looked up at Li Yi and Mingzhu and said, why don't you try? They definitely wanted to try, but although his and Mingzhu's future child would have the surname Li, he wouldn't be able to inherit the throne of the Jing kingdom. Li Xian's plan as Rui would be in vain. Speaking of which, it was difficult to break through to Grandmaster, but it was even more difficult for a Grandmaster to get pregnant. Now that Rui and Mingzhu had both become Grandmasters, if they wanted to have children in the future, they would have to go through the same hardships that he and Rui had gone through in the past. Li didn't think it was impossible. A lifetime was long and hard work paid off. As long as he changed a few positions and tried a few more times, he would succeed one day. He didn't know if his situation would be better if he became a Grandmaster. Apart from other things, at least his waist wouldn't be so weak anymore. Before Li Yi and Mingzhu could answer, Li Xian shook his head and said, no, even if you can give birth, it will be more than 10 years later. I can't wait that long. Li Yi looked at him for a long time and said, there are so many princes in the Li family. You can just pass the throne to one of them. Li Xian looked at him and said, do you think I'm stupid? If I really pass the throne to someone else, do you think we can still live? It seemed that he wasn't as stupid as he thought. Li looked at him and said, "Just accept your fate. Only you being the emperor is the best. Anyone who wants to be the emperor will not have a good ending." Li Xian seemed to understand something. He looked at him and asked, "You mean only those who don't want to be the emperor are the most suitable?" Li shook his head and said, "I didn't say anything. There are countless princes who want to be the emperor. The only ones who don't want to be the emperor are probably you and Xuanhuan." In the Mathematics Institute, Li Han, who had just solved a difficult mathematical problem, was different from usual. He didn't feel excited at all. Instead, he felt an inexplicable annoyance. A beautiful girl walked in and said with a smile, "Brother Han, I cooked lotus seed porridge. Try it while it's hot." Li Han felt even more bitter when he saw the beautiful girl, but he still squeezed out a smile and said, "Thank you, Sister Wang." Chapter 1160. "Sir, how do you solve this question?" Li Han asked him with a question. Li glanced at it and felt it was strange. Although this question required a lot of twists and turns, with his ability he could solve even more difficult questions. It was strange that he couldn't solve this one. However, everyone had a blind spot in their thinking. This was normal. When Li picked up the pen and was about to tell him, Li Han asked casually, "Sir, is Duanwu not at home?" She took Duaner and Xiao Rui outside to play. Li didn't raise his head. "Why are you looking for her?" "Nothing." Li Han shook his head and suddenly said, "Sir, I suddenly understand how to solve this question. I'll solve it myself first. I'll come back tomorrow to show you." Li put down the pen and looked at him. "Duanwu is not at home tomorrow either." "Then after I." Li Han realized something was wrong as soon as he opened his mouth. He immediately said, "I just have something to talk to her about. I still have some doubts about mathematics. I'll come back in a few days to ask, sir." Li drank some water and asked, "You're not wondering about mathematics, but why Duanwu ignores you?" Li Han froze in place. After a moment he sighed and said, "A girl's mind is even harder than a mathematics question." Li looked at him and asked, "If you want Duanwu to pay attention to you, you have to first tell me who the younger sister of the Wang family is?" Li Han sighed again and said, "Her name is Wang Ling. The Wang family and the royal family had always had a close relationship. 7 or 8 years ago, they had bet on the right treasure and married their first daughter to Li Xian, who was still the heir. Now that the heir's wife had become the empress, the Wang family had become the most famous family in the capital. Wang Ling was Wang Qin's younger sister. Her engagement to Li Han was even before Li Xian and Wang Qin. Li didn't know if the Wang family was betting everywhere or if the Wang family's master's eyes were really extraordinary. He only found out after asking Li Han that it was the latter. The Wang family only had 2 daughters. One was married to Li Xian. One had been betrothed to Li Han since she was young. Wang Linger and Li Han were childhood friends. Speaking of which, the Dragon Boat Festival only appeared later. Unfortunately, there were some things that didn't care about first come, first served. There was no way to reason this out. Is there no way to make a girl not be jealous? Li Han looked at him and asked for help. "Sir, what should I do?" In his eyes, the teacher could teach him more than just arithmetic. He had so many mistresses. If he had 1/10 of his teacher's ability, he wouldn't have made things like this. It was a woman's nature to be jealous. A woman who wasn't jealous wasn't a woman. Even when Wanru and Rui would get jealous for no reason, not to mention the jealous Rui. If he knew how to stop a girl from getting jealous, he wouldn't have been beaten up so badly by her in the past. Li Han was just left out. Back then he risked his life every single time, living under the threat of autumn water, living in fear. Li looked at him and asked, "Tell me the truth. Do you like that sister from the Wang family?" Li Han pondered for a long time before saying, "Ever since she was young, she always followed behind me in everything. I treated her like a younger sister. I would beat up anyone who bullied her. At that time, Lady Mother told me that she would be my consort. We promised when we were young that I would marry her when I grew up." Li continued to ask, "Do you like her?" "I like the Dragon Boat Festival." Li Han looked up at him and said, "But I can't hurt the sister from the Wang family. She trusts me the most. Sir, I really don't know what to do." Relationships were complicated. Li could teach him arithmetic, but he couldn't teach him these things. Should he break the engagement with the Wang family and choose to be alone for the rest of his life? He could live a carefree life with the Dragon Boat Festival and leave the Wang family's childhood sweetheart alone until she grew old, or marry someone else and live a depressed life, or he could keep his promise and give up on the Dragon Boat Festival and complete the engagement with the Wang family, or there were other choices. These were all decisions that Li Han had to make himself. Even if Dragon Boat Festival was his sister, he wouldn't give Li Han any guidance on this matter. Li Han left. Before he left, he didn't get any answers from Li Yi. Li Yi picked up the teacup and found that there was no water left in the cup. A figure came out from the back of the hall and refilled his cup. Li Yi looked at Dragon Boat Festival and asked softly, "Do you blame me?" He could tell Li Han that he didn't care about the engagement. A good man was the one who courageously pursued true love. He was Dragon Boat Festival's brother, so he naturally had to think for her first. If it was 7 or 10 years ago before he came to this world, when he first came to this world, he would have told Li Han to pursue free love. This was what a young man should do, however, he wouldn't do that now. This wasn't the modern world after all. There were rules here. Maybe Dragon Boat Festival would be sad because of Li Han's choice. Maybe the other girl's hair would turn white overnight because of him. However, these were all his choices. The girl shook her head and said, "Actually, they met first. Brother, am I too jealous? I ignored Li Han because I wanted him to leave Wang Linger. Am I very bad? There is no order in this matter and there is no right or wrong." Li Yi stood up and patted her shoulder. He said, "I believe that you will handle everything well." The mathematics college and the women's college were on vacation. When Li Yi and Xianxia walked around the college, they could only see some servants. The teachers and students had already gone home. Xuanhuan has locked himself in the mathematics college for the past few days. He said that he wouldn't come out until he proved the theorem. He didn't want to see anyone. Xianxia looked at a building in the distance and said worriedly, "I'm really worried that he will get sick from holding himself in." Li Han already knew that the theorem wasn't something he could prove in his lifetime. He was just avoiding it. He said that he wouldn't see anyone, but in fact he just didn't dare to see two people. A beautiful girl came from the front and bowed to Xianxia. She said, "Greetings, Sister Ning Er." Xianxia looked at her and asked, "Ling Er, you went to see Xuanhuan again?" The beautiful girl nodded and said, "Brother Han needs to use his brain every day. I cooked some lotus root and pork ribs soup. It can nourish the blood, replenish the marrow, calm the nerves and strengthen the brain. Go." Xianxia nodded and said, "He likes pork ribs soup the most." She looked at Xianxia and bowed to Li Yi before leaving. "Then I'll go first." Xianxia sighed and said, "I just saw that Dragon Boat Festival had passed. I don't know what Xuanhuan will do." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Let them worry about their own matters." Xianxia looked at the pavilion in the middle of the lake in the distance and said, "I haven't gone fishing in a long time. Let's go fishing by the lake." "Okay." Li Yi nodded. Xianxia revealed a smile on her face. She subconsciously held onto Li Yi's hand and walked forward quickly. After 2 steps, she seemed to realize something and quickly let go of his arm. Her face once again revealed a reserved expression. Li Yi still liked to see her innocent and unaffected appearance. She didn't want to change herself for others and pretend to be reserved. "Ning Er." Li Yi looked at her and said, "You can do whatever you want in the future. Don't worry. No matter what you are, I like you." Her body trembled. She raised her head and looked at Li Yi. After a long time, the reserved expression on her face disappeared. She held onto his arm and happily said, "Then let's go fishing first. Then we'll go to the streets. I want to eat candy people. I want to eat 10. At the entrance of a small building in the academy, the beautiful girl looked at the girl in front of her. Her face was slightly flustered. She quickly said, I only cooked some soup. I didn't know that Sister Dragon Boat Festival had also cooked. I'll go back first." Dragon Boat Festival looked at the girl who hurriedly turned around and was about to leave. Her face revealed a complicated expression. Pop. A crisp sound of porcelain breaking came from behind. The beautiful girl turned her head and saw that the soup bowl in Dragon Boat Festival's hand had fallen to the ground and shattered into pieces. "It's all my fault." Dragon Boat Festival walked over and looked at her. She said with some distress, "The soup has been poured away. We can only let him drink Sister Linger's soup. Let's go up together." Chapter 1161. Li Han's seclusion officially ended, not because he proved Goldbach's conjecture, but because Wang Linger gave him a bowl of soup during the Dragon Boat Festival. This bowl of lotus root and pork rib soup was not only good for the brain but also for the body. After drinking the soup, he immediately came back to life. When he was grilling the fish, his movements became faster. This way the fish was more tender, more uniform and more delicious. In the past few years, Li Han had been obsessed with mathematics and the Dragon Boat Festival, so he did not neglect his skills in grilling fish. The fish had just been caught by Xianxia. The academy had protected this lake very well. The fish in the lake were delicious and naturally free of pollution. Whether it was steamed, boiled, stewed or barbecued, they were all very good ingredients. Li Xian did not have such good fortune this time. He did not bother Li Yi for the past 2 days because the Empress was pregnant again. The due date was around the new year, so he had to stay by her side. Xianxia fed Li Yi a piece of fresh fish and asked, "When are we going back to Rui City? I haven't seen Xiaomu for a long time." Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "After the new year." He did not know when they would come back after leaving the capital this time. The journey was long. Although the old lady was healthy, she had to plan the route well to minimize the bumpiness and fatigue. Moreover, before leaving she had to see some old friends in the capital and say goodbye to some people. Xianxia suddenly lowered her head. Her eyes were a little dim. She said, "I have asked my mother. She said she wants to stay in the capital and will not go with us." Concubine Yen was the wisest woman Li Yi had ever met. This kind of person was usually very assertive. Xianxia wanted her to leave with them, but she refused, so there was no room for negotiation. Moreover, as the old imperial concubine, she could not leave the capital city as she pleased. Li Yi held her hand and said, "Don't worry. I will come back with you to see her every year." Xianxia's eyes lit up again. She suddenly leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. Then, she blushed and lowered her head to work on the grilled fish in front of her. In the distance, Li Han was flipping the roasted fish. He withdrew his gaze and let out a long sigh. "Big brother Han, if you're tired, you should rest for a while." The beautiful girl walked over, took out a handkerchief, and gently wiped the sweat off his forehead. Li Han peeked at Duanwu, who was standing at the side. When he saw that her face did not reveal any unusual expression, he was delighted and flipped the iron skewers in his hand even faster. The Jing kingdom had undoubtedly become the center of the world. The capital was becoming more and more prosperous, gathering merchants from various countries. He said angrily, he dared to sell fake test papers back then, he should have expected this day. After kicking him a few times he still could not vent his anger. He picked up a long bench from a roadside stall and smashed it hard at him. In the end, the bench in his hand did not land on the person on the ground. A young man grabbed the bench in his hand and looked at him. He said, "It's wrong for him to sell fake test papers, but it's reasonable for you to buy fake test papers. You've hit him and you've scolded him. Enough is enough." The green-robed scholar saw that the other party was about the same age as him, but he acted like he was teaching someone a lesson. He felt even more indignant and said angrily, "Who do you think you are?" Smack. Li gave him a backhand slap. Although he did not use much strength, that person was still sent flying. He lost a few teeth and lay on the ground, unable to recover for a long time. The other companions next to that person were also stunned on the spot. It was the first time in their lives that they had seen someone sent flying with a slap. For a moment they did not dare to rush forward. However, they moved and surrounded Li Yi and Xianxia. One of them quickly ran into the distance. Li Yi looked at Xianxia and asked, "Are you hungry?" Xianxia nodded in embarrassment. Li Yi smiled and said, "Then let's go in and eat something. This restaurant used to taste pretty good. I wonder how it is now." The old man from the restaurant walked to his side and whispered, "Young master, you should leave quickly. You won't be able to leave in a while." One of the young men glared at the old man, and the old man immediately stopped talking. Li Yi looked at the fatty lying on the ground and said to the woman beside him, "You guys come in too." Although the woman did not know the person in front of her, he was definitely not a bad person since he had helped earlier. Seeing his outstanding temperament, she could not help but be influenced by him. She only hesitated for a moment before nodding. She helped the fatty on the ground up and walked in. The old man's expression changed slightly. He looked at a waiter behind him and said, "Quick, go and get the shopkeeper here." Inside the restaurant, although the fatty's face was bruised, he still struggled to get up. He cupped his hands at Li Yi and said, "Thank you for your help just now, brother." He looked at the young man in front of him and then at the woman beside him. He didn't know why, but he felt that he had seen this woman somewhere before. Even this brother of his felt that she was very familiar. "You don't recognize me now? Didn't you say that we were fated when you sold me the fake exam papers?" Li looked at him and said with a strange expression. The fatty's expression changed when he heard this. He trembled and said, You. He was a little terrified. If the person in front of him had also bought his fake exam papers, could it be that he wanted to beat him up by asking him to come in? Li looked at him and said with a smile, "If you hadn't cheated me of 5 coins, I would have kicked you a few times outside." You. Only one person had bought the fake exam papers from him for 5 coins. The fatty immediately remembered that this person was Mu Zi. However, they did not look alike at all. If he was Mu Zi, then he would be the emperor's son-in-law. Then wouldn't the woman beside him be? Peng Er turned his head to look again. He finally understood why he felt so familiar with the woman. He suddenly felt his legs turn to jelly and he almost fell to the ground. The old man walked in from the back door of the restaurant and pointed in front of him, saying, "Shopkeeper, it's them." A middle-aged man walked in front of him. The man did not look old, but his hair was already white. There was another sturdy man beside him. When Li Yi looked over, he was slightly startled. Then he could not help but laugh. Unfortunately, he can only see that after the Jing kingdom has a bone, he can only stand up and walk forward 1 step, 2 steps, but he can't see any further. Li Yi looked at him and suddenly asked, "Don't you hate him?" "Hate, of course I hate him." He nodded and said, "He was a good prime minister but not a good father. Otherwise, the Qin family wouldn't have fallen to such a state, but..." As he spoke, he smiled and waved his hand saying, "It's all in the past. Everything is fine now. People still have to look forward and not always look back." As for Li Yi couldn't give much of an evaluation. He was one of the few people he had met who understood. He admired and admired him. Perhaps it was because the two of them were both beasts in some aspects. He drank a cup of tea and said, "This time the Jianghu of Silla returned to the capital, but there was no news from the capital at all. I really find it a bit strange." Li Yi heard the meaning in his words. It was nothing more than every time he returned to the capital, he would cause a commotion in the capital, wanting everyone to know that he was back. This time he was a little too low-key. He smiled and put down the cup. He stood up and said, "There will be news soon." Crash. In the restaurant, a young official with half of his face swollen flipped over a table and said angrily, "Where is he? Come out." As he walked into the restaurant, more than 10 young people came in one after another. These people had outstanding temperament and were dressed luxuriously. At first glance, one could tell that they were not ordinary people. Behind them, a group of officials quickly came in. Peng Er sat on the innermost stool. Seeing this scene, his body trembled. These people were all the sons of famous officials in the capital. How could they be alarmed? He immediately whispered to the woman beside him, "Quick, go to the back and tell that brother not to come out." After saying that, he realized that the person who bought the fake test papers with 5 copper coins was not an ordinary person. That was the current emperor's son-in-law. Moreover, with Her Royal Highness by his side, what did he have to be afraid of? The ones who should be afraid were those people. At this time, Li Yi and Xianxia had already come out from the back. The official with the swollen face pointed at Li Yi and said loudly, "That's him." A young man beside him looked at him and said with a frown, "You guys were beaten like this by him alone. Do you need to come to the county government to ask for help?" A man behind him smiled and said, "If I had known this would happen, I wouldn't have come to watch the show. What a waste of food and wine." As they talked, they didn't notice that behind them, several people's faces had changed dramatically. Their lips couldn't stop trembling and they couldn't even stand steadily. Li Yi turned to look at Qin and said, "It's not easy to take advantage of you." Chapter 1163. Being invited to a meal by Jianghu of Silla, in the entire capital, there were only a few people who had this kind of qualification. What these young people felt at this moment was naturally not that they were overwhelmed by the favor, but that they were terrified. They were extremely regretful in their hearts. Why did they have to join in the fun today? At this moment they were in a dilemma, but they did not dare to block the way and they all retreated to the corner. And the servants accompanying them hurriedly left. As for the young scholar with a swollen face, his face was already ashen, paralyzed on the ground, and even his lips could not move. Li looked back at the fatty and said, "Do you want to sit down and eat together?" "No need, no need." Peng Er hurriedly shook his head and said, "Thank you, Your Highness Jianghu of Silla." Sitting at this table, one was Princess Xianxia, and the other was His Highness Jianghu of Silla. The matter of him selling fake test papers to His Highness Jianghu of Silla was enough for him to brag for a lifetime. Eating at the same table with His Highness Jianghu of Silla and Princess Xianxia, what virtue or ability did he, Fatty Peng, have? Even the smoke on his ancestral grave did not dare to emit like this. Li no longer forced him. He looked at him and said, "You can be considered to have hands and feet. If you use your mouth to do business, you will definitely not lose money. In the future, it is better to do less of this kind of thing." The woman next to Peng Er knelt in front of Li Yi and hurriedly said, "Brother Peng sold fake test papers just to treat my seriously ill mother. Please forgive him this time, Your Highness. We will definitely return the money in the future." He was wrong to sell fake test papers, but those who intend to cheat are not righteous people. Li Yi waved his hand and said, "In the future it will be fine." Peng Er nodded and said, "I will definitely remember Your Highness Jianghu of Silla's teachings." Li Yi looked at him and suddenly asked, "Are you interested in working at Jianghu of Silla's residence?" He had had 2 brief encounters with Peng Er. Although his act of reselling fake exam papers seemed to be beneath him, the fact that he was able to stand out among all the fake exam dealers in the capital and successfully attract so much hatred showed that he still had a lot of redeeming qualities. After all, there were so many unscrupulous dealers in the capital who sold fake test papers, but he was the only one who was beaten on the street. This kind of person was born to do business. After they left this time, the Li family still needed a reliable person to take care of the business. This Peng Er would be of great use if he was properly trained. Peng Er was stunned at first, but after he realized it, he immediately knelt on the ground and said, Li family of Li family, Your Highness Jiang Silla, Your Highness, Your Highness. Li Yi waved his hand and motioned for Peng Er to get up. A middle-aged man in official robes walked in from the door. He tidied up his clothes and said respectfully, This lowly official is the capital's magistrate Lin de Greetings, Your Highness Jiang of Silla and Princess Xianxia. When Li Yi left, the capital's magistrate was still Lu Dayo. Now that Lu Dayo had become the capital governor, this new magistrate was a new face. His face was a bit frightened as he said, This lowly official was not strict enough and alarmed Your Highness. Please punish me. Li Yi looked at this magistrate and asked, Fighting in the street with no regard for human life, what about the law? The middle-aged man looked at the young man with a swollen face and immediately said, Your Highness, rest assured, this lowly official will investigate this case and punish it according to the law. Li Yi looked at Xianxia and asked, Are you full? Xianxia nodded and said, I'm full. Li Yi stood up and looked at the magistrate and said, I'll leave this to Magistrate Lin. The magistrate immediately bowed and said, Your Highness, please rest assured. Li Yi waved at Qin and said, Let's go, send off Your Highness. The magistrate immediately bowed and said, Take care, Your Highness. Li Yi and Xianxia walked out of the restaurant and parted ways with Peng Er and the woman. They walked towards the Jianghu of Silla's residence. In this big capital, there were not many people who could talk to him nicely. Qin was one of them. Although he lived like a beast, he was also free and easy. He immersed himself in his own world and didn't care about the outside world. He was a smart person who could see through the world. At the entrance of the restaurant, Wu Er looked in the direction Li Yi disappeared in before looking away. Wu Er scratched his head and murmured, His Highness seems different from before, but I can't tell what's different. Qin smiled and said, In the past, His Highness Jiang of Silla was like a sharp sword, showing off its edge. The current His Highness is still a sword, just that he has hidden the edge of the sword. Wu Er scratched his head. Although he still didn't understand, he was used to Fifth Lord not speaking human language. When they walked into the restaurant, the magistrate walked up and said with a smile, I'll get someone to compensate for the restaurant's loss. There's no need for it to be doubled, just compensate at the original price. Qin waved his hand and said, Thank you in advance, magistrate. The magistrate's heart skipped a beat. This restaurant manager and Jiang of Silla seemed to be familiar with each other. His background should not be small. A smile appeared on his face again and he said, Of course, of course. After walking out of the restaurant, most of the young masters heaved a sigh of relief. They wiped the cold sweat off their foreheads and felt like they had survived a disaster. One of them heaved a long sigh of relief and said, Fortunately, we didn't offend Jiang of Silla. It said that a few years ago, when Jiang of Silla wasn't Jiang of Silla, many young masters of the top families in the capital city were dragged to the palace gates to be flogged because they offended him. They couldn't get out of bed for a few months. There was another time when more than 10 important officials of the imperial court had to personally go to a restaurant to retrieve their juniors. It could be said that they were completely humiliated. As the crowd heaved a sigh of relief, they looked at one person in the crowd and said gratefully, Thank you for reminding us just now, Brother Zheng. Otherwise this would have led to a disaster. The young man they called Brother Zheng was still pale. He looked at them and said with a trembling voice, You think it's over? He wiped the sweat on his palms on his clothes. These people had not experienced some things, so how would they know the fear of the entire capital city being dominated by Jiang of Silla? This was not the end, but just the beginning. Jiang of Silla had returned. This capital city would probably experience another huge shock. In a certain official's mansion, an official who had just rushed home looked at his son and asked in horror, Did you have a conflict with Jiang of Silla just now? No conflict, no conflict. The young man immediately said, We just went to watch the show. We definitely didn't have a conflict with His Highness Jiang of Silla. Watch the show? The official picked up a bamboo stick and hit him. He said angrily, Is His Highness Jiang of Silla's show something you can watch? The young man looked at him and said tentatively, Father Jiang of Silla? Jiang of Silla didn't say anything and just let us leave. Nothing big happened, right? What do you know? The middle-aged man glared at him again and immediately walked out of the room. He said loudly, "Someone prepare a generous gift, the thicker the better." At the same time, many official residences in the capital city had carriages full of gifts and were gathering in the same direction. Shui Mansion. Old General Shui drank the wine in his bowl and laughed. "Little brat, every time you come back you cause such a big commotion. You don't even know to come to the Shui Mansion to take a look." An old woman poured him another bowl of wine and said, "His Highness Jiang of Silla's status is different now. When you see him you can't act like this again. What's wrong with Jiang of Silla again?" Old General Shui curled his lips and said, "I lent the pillar that Jiang of Silla slept on when he went to court." Zeng Mansion. On this day, Zeng Shichen, who was already the Minister of Revenue, changed into casual clothes and walked out of the mansion. Capital Governor's Mansion. On this day, Capital Governor Lu Dayo did not bring any attendants with him and hurriedly left. Li Duan looked at Emingzu and hesitated for a moment before saying, "Auntie?" Before Li Yi could correct him, he ran outside with Xiao Rui. "The Zhao Kingdom has sent an ambassador." Emingzu sat beside him and said, "In the past few months, Zhao Yi personally led the army and broke through the cities of the Zhao Kingdom with irresistible force. Now, half of the Zhao Kingdom has fallen into the hands of the Qi Kingdom." Li Yi thought about it and asked, "The Zhao Kingdom wants to borrow troops?" Emingzu nodded and said, "What the courtiers mean is that although we have old grudges with the Zhao Kingdom, if the Qi Kingdom conquers the Zhao Kingdom, it will become a greater threat to us. In order to prevent the Qi Kingdom from growing stronger, we should send troops." Li Yi shook his head and said, "I'm afraid it's too late." Sending troops was not something that could be done on a whim. Not only did they have to mobilize the troops, they also had to prepare rations and pay for the troops. In addition to the long journey, by the time the troops guarding the borders received these orders, it would already be too late. This time it could be said that Zhao Yi had made up his mind to go crazy. He was the kind of person who would kill anything that stood in his way. His expansion would eventually become a serious problem for the Wu Kingdom and the Jing Kingdom. Neither kingdom would sit by and do nothing. It was because he knew this that he sent troops so quickly and wanted to conquer the Zhao Kingdom in the shortest time possible. When the Zhao Kingdom was completely conquered by the Qi Kingdom, it would not be easy to touch them. Emingzu nodded and said, "Even if it's too late, we have to be prepared. Once the Qi Kingdom grows stronger, they will eventually point their spear at us." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Zhao Yi is a smart man. Without heaven's punishment and cannons, he will not send troops to the Jing Kingdom or the Wu Kingdom." The emergence of gunpowder and cannons had made the Jing Kingdom and the Wu Kingdom look like they had turned on a cheat code. In terms of military strength, they had rapidly advanced to the forefront of the world. Coupled with suitable tactics, they were almost invincible. Zhao Yi knew this very well. Without heaven's punishment, he would not dare to do so. The two of them were discussing this matter in the courtyard. Outside the courtyard, Li Duan and little Rui were sitting on the swing. Suddenly, he turned his head to look at her and asked, "Little Rui, will you marry me in the future?" "Of course." The little girl turned to look at him and said matter-of-factly, "We've agreed. Are you going back on your word?" No. Li Duan hurriedly shook his head and said, "However, if you marry me in the future, you can't call that aunt anymore." "Why not?" The little girl blinked and looked at him curiously. "What else can I call you if not aunt?" "Call me mother," Li Duan thought for a moment and said, "Also, the little auntie who gave you the candy just now, you can't call her little auntie. You have to call her Lil Miss like me." The affairs of the Zhao Kingdom were attended by countless important officials in the imperial court. A few days before the new year, Li Yi went out to visit a few old generals and gave them the gifts he had received a few days ago. Then came the new year. On the third day of the first lunar month in the 5th year of Jingping, something big happened in the capital city. Even for the entire Jing Kingdom, this was a major event. On this day the Empress gave birth to a baby boy. Both mother and child were safe. Chapter 1165. Li Xin was so happy that he went crazy. Seeing him stand up and sit down and stand up again with an uncontrollable excitement on his face, Li Yi suddenly felt a little distressed for Li Xian's son, who didn't even have a name until now. His name was the Emperor. Empress Wang Qin gave birth to 2 princesses, and imperial concubine Xin Su gave birth to a princess. Li Xian's hair was about to turn white from worry. If Xiao Rui was a prince, Li Yi felt that Li Xian had already titled himself as the emperor. The next day, Li Xian announced the news that the empress's legitimate son would be the crown prince. If it wasn't for the fact that his youngest son couldn't even crawl, then the imperial edict would be the succession edict. The one who was obviously relieved was Li Han. Li Yi clearly felt that he walked a lot more briskly. Li Han was 17 years old this year, which was definitely considered young. Young people were prone to make mistakes and didn't think about things comprehensively. Most of the time they could only see the surface. Li Xian's crown prince didn't even have teeth. Even if he was educated according to the standard of an emperor, it would take at least 10 or 20 years for him to be able to take charge. Li Xian couldn't wait for 10 or 20 years. Therefore, before Wang Qin gave birth to the crown prince, Li Xian still had a bit of face. He would take into account all aspects and not pass the throne to Li Han. Now he would not pass the throne to Li Han, but His Royal Highness Prince Jin couldn't run away, because the crown prince was still young. When the emperor experienced the suffering of the people, he needed someone to assist him. Looking at Li Han talking to Duanwu with a smile on his face, Li Yi couldn't bear to break his dream, so he let him sleep a little longer for the time being. This year's court meeting was not on the first day of the first lunar month. Those days were the empress's due date. In the royal family, this was a first-class event, so the date of the court meeting naturally had to be postponed. Now it was a double happiness. Li Yi originally did not want to participate in the Grand Court Assembly, but he wanted to see what Mingzi looked like wearing a phoenix crown and a phoenix cloak. She would only wear those clothes when she was in court. Xianxia, who was in charge of the women's union and many colleges in the capital, would also appear at the imperial court conference. The Qi kingdom, the Wu kingdom and the Zhao kingdom had all sent envoys to the Jing kingdom. This time they didn't just send envoys casually. Instead, they sent envoys to the Jing kingdom with formal etiquette. This was probably the pinnacle of diplomatic relations in the history of the Jing kingdom. Your Highness. Your Highness Jianghu of Silla. Greetings, Your Highness Jianghu of Silla. I hereby abide by the first imperial edict, record the ceremony, bow down to the will of the people, and sincerely inform the heavens and the earth, the ancestral temple, and the country that I hereby confer the title of Crown Prince and appoint him as the Eastern Palace's Crown Prince. This was the first imperial edict announced by the eunuchs in the Grand Court Assembly. Li Xian's intention to shift the blame to others had been going on for several years. This little fellow, Li Zhe, became the Crown Prince on the first day of his birth, and became the future master of the Jing kingdom. He had only been in this world for less than 24 hours, but Li Xian had already praised him to the heavens. Words like talent and outstanding were endless. The hundreds of officials could do nothing about it, and there were countless people who looked bitter. How could they, as the officials, not know what His Majesty was thinking? However, it was not easy for the Empress to give birth to a legitimate son, so no one would raise any objection at this time. The second imperial edict was to expand the number of members of the State Affair Council. The original number of members of the State Affair Council was increased from 15 to 20. The State Affair Council was an institution proposed by the eldest princess several years ago. The members of this institution were composed of 2 prime ministers, 6 ministers, the imperial censor, the governor of the capital, and several important officials. Among them, the name of Prince Jin Li Han was also included. No one was allowed to monopolize the power when there was a difficult decision to be made. The members of the State Affair Council had to discuss and make a decision together, and then report it to His Majesty or the eldest princess. His Majesty had no objection to this proposal. In recent years, the decision of the State Affair Council had been passed by His Majesty and the eldest princess. To some extent, the existence of the State Affair Council allowed His Majesty to be lazy with a clear conscience. This made the hundreds of officials doubt His Majesty's intentions more than once. However, this was indeed beneficial to the country, so no one could raise any objection to it. Every member of the State Affair Council could be a prime minister. From then on, all the officials in the imperial court and even the literati of the Jing kingdom aimed to enter the State Affair Council. The imperial edict to appoint the crown prince and increase the number of members of the State Affair Council were the 2 most important matters. What followed was a long and tedious report from an official that everyone loved to listen to. Within these 4 hours, they would know the changes in the military, economy, politics, population, and system of the Jing kingdom in the past year. The Jing kingdom had been making progress every year. They had God's punishment and cannons which could intimidate all the other countries. The national treasury was filled day by day, and various new policies that were beneficial to the people were introduced continuously. This was the result of the hard work of all the people present here for a year. These results would be written on the imperial board and posted on the walls of the palace, which was transparent to the people of the Jing kingdom. Li was actually not very interested in these things. He looked at Mingzu, who was sitting above him, and thought to himself, I must remind her to take this dress with her when I leave in a few days. Chapter 1166. 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, none of the officials in the hall would have imagined that one day, they would be able to witness such a grand court conference. Politics, economy, population, agriculture, commerce. Almost every aspect that they could think of was developing at a gratifying speed. In the past, they could not see the future of the Jing kingdom because they were confused. Now, they still could not see the future of the Jing kingdom because the Jing kingdom's development had far exceeded their imagination. Of course, the Grand Court Conference brought not only joy but also worry to the officials. Especially after Qin Chong, the provincial governor of Shuzhou, presented the memorial, almost half of the people in the court changed their expressions. They were suspicious, shocked, incredulous, and deeply regretful. This was the first time Qin Chong, the provincial governor of Shuzhou, attended a Grand Court Conference. Regardless of whether it was the old officials who had been in the court for decades or the new officials in the court in recent years, the name Qin Chong was no stranger to them. In the past, the Duke of Chen's household had been so illustrious. Although it could not cover the sky with one hand in the capital, a brick thrown on the street could hit a marquee. The Qin clan was already one of the top clans. The Qin family used to be glorious. Later, because they were involved in the Cui family's rebellion, they declined overnight. Later, they completely disappeared from the capital. Some people knew that he had become the provincial governor of Shuzhou in the fief of the jianghu of Silla, but some people had completely forgotten about him. Today, this man, who was once a prominent figure in the capital, once again walked in front of the people. He brought a few pieces of news. In the past 5 years, the population of Shuzhou had officially surpassed the capital and became the most populous city in the Jing kingdom. The tax revenue of Shuzhou last year was 20% of the tax revenue of the entire Jing kingdom. This did not exceed the tax revenue, which saved them some face. But that was only Shuzhou. The tax revenue of Shuzhou was 20% of the tax revenue of the Jing kingdom. This meant that Shuzhou alone was equivalent to more than 10 provinces in the Jing kingdom. But this had nothing to do with them. Because as early as 5 years ago, the court officials unanimously discussed and almost couldn't wait to give all the tax collection rights of Shu province for the next 50 years to Jianghu of Silla. They even gave the entire Shu province to Jianghu of Silla. At that time they were still wondering if they should give 2 more. At the time they had thought that as long as he could leave the capital, anything would be fine. 5 years ago, a prefecture in the Jing kingdom was worth more than 10 Shu prefectures. 5 years later, Shu Prefecture was worth more than 10 ordinary prefectures in the Jing kingdom. It was more than 100 times more. It had only been 5 years. No one knew what would happen in Shuzhou in 50 years. All the officials in the hall were filled with regret. They couldn't help but turn their heads to look at the figures standing at the very front. They didn't know whether to feel fear or respect. Li Yi had been watching the progress of the Imperial Court Conference. After the officials of the various prefectures in the Jing kingdom finished their reports, it was time for the envoys from other countries to meet the emperor. Several years ago the Jing kingdom was weak. The envoys of Qi and Zhao acted like they were in their own garden in the golden palace of the Jing kingdom. Their words and actions were quite inappropriate. But now the situation was completely different. After presenting the generous gifts, the envoys of the small countries showed their subservience. The envoys of the Wu kingdom didn't send any gifts. Her Majesty just sent someone to deliver a letter of credence. In the first month of the 5th year of Jingha, the Wu kingdom and the Jing kingdom officially established diplomatic relations. From then on, they would be friendly neighbors, non-aggression, trade barriers would be removed, and trade with each other. The gifts sent by the envoys of the Zhao kingdom were very generous, because they came to ask for help. The army of the Qi kingdom was approaching the imperial city of the Zhao kingdom. If the Jing kingdom didn't lend a helping hand, it wouldn't take long for the Zhao kingdom to disappear in the long river of history. Although the envoys of the Qi kingdom were not as enthusiastic as those of the Wu kingdom, they also expressed their intention to establish diplomatic relations. When they presented themselves, the envoys of the Zhao kingdom kept a straight face from the beginning to the end. The imperial court conference started in the morning and lasted for several hours. It didn't end until the afternoon. A few of the old generals and some of the senior officials in the court had already been given a seat by Li Xian before the court session had even begun. The younger officials, on the other hand, had been standing the entire time. When the court session ended, almost all of them were limping. It was just a few hours. Li didn't feel anything. After the imperial court conference was over, he was the first to leave. He didn't walk far when he heard a hurried voice behind him. "Your Highness Jiang of Silla, Your Highness Jiang of Silla." The voice was very familiar. Li Yi turned around and saw Wei Liang jogging toward him. Wei Liang came with the envoy of the Wu Kingdom. Li Yi saw him just now. It was just that it wasn't convenient to talk to him in that situation. Li Yi and Wei Liang hadn't seen each other for a long time. He smiled and asked, "How is your empress?" Wei Liang smiled and said, "Her Majesty has just ascended the throne. Everything is fine. It's just that she's a little busy with the affairs of the state every day. To wear the crown, one must bear its weight." Mingzu was like that. Yang Liuqing was also like that. The Wu Kingdom had just settled down. There were many things waiting to be done. Of course she would be very busy. There were many things that she had never touched before. However, he had Old Man Wang and the others to watch him. He wouldn't make any big mistakes. "Brotherly, long time no see." Another voice came from his side. Li Yi turned his head and saw Yang Yanzhou, who had just walked out of the hall. He was here on behalf of Zhao Yi. His purpose was naturally to stop the Jing Kingdom from helping the Zhao Kingdom. However, the imperial court of the Jing Kingdom had already made a decision on this. Although the Jing Kingdom and the Zhao Kingdom had old grudges, the Qi Kingdom was ambitious. They would never let the Qi Kingdom become stronger. Half a month ago, the order to stop the Qi Kingdom and help the Zhao Kingdom had been sent out urgently. By now, the Jing Kingdom's army at the border of Qi and Zhao must have taken action. Li Yi shook his head and said, "What are you doing here instead of staying by Zhao Yi's side? Zhao Yi must know that no matter who he sends, it will be useless." Yang Yanzhou smiled and said, "I have to try to know whether it will be useful or not." "Now that you have tried, is it useful?" Yang Yanzhou shook his head with a bitter smile. Li Yi was too lazy to talk about these things. He waved his hand casually and said, "Before I came out, there was still soup in the pot. If you don't want to talk about national affairs, you can come to the mansion of Jiang of Silla when you have time." "Of course." Wei Liang waved his hand. Yang Yanzhou smiled and said, "In that case, I will pay a visit to Brother Li tomorrow." The officials who came out of the hall were surprised to see His Highness Jiang of Silla and the envoys of Qi and Wu talking cheerfully and wittily. It was obvious that this was not the first time they had met each other. They naturally did not think that Jiang of Silla had committed treason. However, even the envoys of the Qi Kingdom and the Wu Kingdom seemed to be on good terms with him. Whether he was in the capital or not, Jiang of Silla was still the same Jiang of Silla. An official looked at the back of Jiang of Silla disappearing. He quickly took a few steps forward and said to the slowly walking Prime Minister Xin, "Prime Minister Xin, Shu Province cannot be handed over to Jiang of Silla like this." Chapter 1167. The Shu Province of today was no longer the Shu Province of the past. The Shu Province of today was practically the largest treasury of the Jing Kingdom. In just 5 years, it had surpassed the capital in terms of population and economy. Who knew what it would be like in 50 years? A country within a country? This was something that he absolutely did not want to see. This was also something that all the officials in the court did not want to see. Even though they had unanimously decided to give Shu Province to the Jiang of Silla a few years ago, what was credibility? What a country needed was always profit. The official walked up to Xianxiang and said hurriedly, "Just now in the hall, you must have heard what Provincial Governor Qinchong said. The Shu Province is so rich now. The court must take it back." Xianxiang, who had been walking slowly, stopped in his tracks. His eyes turned cloudy. He looked at the official and asked, "What did Minister Wei just say?" The middle-aged official looked at him and repeated, "We must take back Shu Province from the hands of the Jiang of Silla." Xianxiang asked doubtfully, "The Jiang of Silla? What's wrong with the Jiang of Silla?" The middle-aged official moved closer to him and raised his voice. "The Jing Kingdom's Shu Province cannot fall into the hands of the Jiang of Silla again." Xianxiang asked in surprise, "Shu Province? What's wrong with Shu Province?" The middle-aged official was speechless. Xianxiang pointed at his ears and smiled, "I'm getting old. My ears don't work so well anymore. Minister Wei, please don't blame me. I was thinking a few days ago that these old bones of mine really couldn't hold on any longer. I was planning to resign from His Majesty in a few months." The middle-aged official was shocked. He immediately said, "Prime Minister Xin is the pillar of the court. You are a role model for us officials. If you leave, who else can suppress the treacherous officials in the court?" Xianxiang sighed and looked at the middle-aged official. He said, "For a country, although benefits are the most important, we can't just care about the benefits in front of us. We have to live up to our own conscience and the conscience of the world." The official opened his mouth, Prime Minister Xin? Without the treacherous officials you speak of, there wouldn't be today's Jing Kingdom, and there wouldn't be today's Minister of Wei. Xianxiang looked at him. His back was no longer bent and his eyes were no longer turbid. He spoke again. His Majesty hasn't said anything. Minister Wei, you don't have to worry about these things. Before Prime Minister Xin left, he looked at him again and said, today the people standing in the court already owe him too much. We can't owe any more. If we owe any more, I'm afraid we will suffer retribution. After Xianxiang left, the middle-aged official stood there in a daze. He only felt that his throat was a little dry. He licked his dry lips. Xianxiang's words were very clear. If he insisted on targeting Jianghu of Silla, Xianxiang would not help him. At that moment he finally realized that Jianghu of Silla was much more terrifying than he had imagined. However, he was only thinking about the Jing Kingdom. What did he do wrong? Confusion and hesitation appeared on his face. He slowly took a step forward and disappeared in the direction of the palace gate alone. When Li Yi came out, the pot was really stewing soup. The soup had been stewing for a few hours and the taste was very rich. Ever since he realized that he had underestimated Mingzu, he picked up the skills that he had put aside for many years. She only had a low starting point, but there was a lot of room for her to grow, far beyond Li Yi's imagination. Xuanhuan ran over and said pitifully, I also want to drink royal sister's soup, but she won't give it to me. Li Yi patted her head and said, your royal sister has to deal with so many affairs of the country every day. She needs to nourish her body. I'll make your favorite soup later. The soup that Mingzi drank naturally couldn't be given to Xuanhuan. It wasn't because she didn't need it, but she was only 18 years old. At the very least, it would take a few more years for Li Yi's beastly and guilty feelings to dispel. After finishing the soup for the two of them, he still had to do other things. This time, when he left the capital city, he would come back to accompany Mingzu and Xuanhuan. He wouldn't make such a big fuss. Therefore, the Jianghu of Silla residence, which had always only accepted gifts but not given gifts, was finally generous for a while. Today Li Yi held a banquet in the residence. It wasn't a big banquet, but he sent invitations to all who he thought needed to say goodbye. The first person to visit was Lu Yi. He had just finished patrolling the Beijing-Hebei region. After entering the small courtyard, he quickly walked up to him with a slightly excited face. Your Excellency, you're back. When he was still a county lieutenant, Lu Yi called him Your Excellency. This form of address had almost never changed over the years. Li Yi habitually patted him on the shoulder and said with a smile, you're already a minister. Show some of the minister's manner and aura. The minister of the Ministry of Justice, who had always been impartial and upright, showed an embarrassed expression at this moment. Lu Daiyou and Xing Shichen visited him at the same time. Both of them came from the Anxi County government, so they naturally contacted each other frequently in the past few years. For some reason, Xing Shichen also hooked up with the two of them. Two ministers and a governor of the capital city had already occupied 3 seats in the State Affairs Council. As soon as Lu Daiyou and Xing Shichen sat down, Li Yi heard a rough voice. Ha, little Li, I've known you for so many years, but this is the first time I've taken advantage of you. Today take out all the good wine in your residence. I want to drink to my heart's content. Little brat, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You must treat me with good wine and good dishes. It was rare for old General Shui and old General Ma to be united. There was no question of who was bigger or smaller, or who could urinate higher or further. It seemed that they were ready to make a killing on Li Yi. Li Yi smiled and said, rest assured, old generals. Today I will personally cook and treat you well. Li Han had originally planned to sneak out with Duan Wu, but Li Yi conveniently grabbed him as a helper. In the entire capital, Li Yi really could not find a more qualified roaster than him. The fish caught from the lake of the Mathematics Institute were still fresh, and there was no shortage of sauce. All that was left was Li Han. Dong Wenyun came together with the Xin family and the Wang family. Dong Wenyun was the son-in-law of the Xin family. The Xin family could be considered as one family with 2 prime ministers and an imperial concubine in the palace. However, the Wang family's empress gave birth to the crown prince. It was hard to say who would be the final winner. However, at least on the surface they seemed to be in harmony. There were also some relatives of the Li family, but there were only a few of them. Wei Liang and Yang Yanzhou also chose to freeload today. Li Yi reckoned that he had to find a few helpers. Otherwise, he would not be able to handle so many people at once. Today, the Jianghu of Silla residence, from the inside to the outside, from the master to the servants, everyone was exceptionally busy. Wei Xian stood at the entrance of the Jianghu of Silla residence and hesitated for a long time. He did not know whether he should step in or not. After he returned, he thoroughly investigated the information about the jianghu of Silla. The results of the investigation made him unable to sleep for the entire night. His poetry was unparalleled. Even an uneducated child could recite a few sentences. Every word of his could be sold at a sky-high price. He had never seen anyone whose calligraphy was sold at a price of a word. He had reached the peak of what a scholar could achieve. He improved the art of interrogation by torture and reduced the number of cruel officials in the Jing kingdom. He offered the horseshoes and created the Heavenly Punishment Society. The army of the Jing kingdom was invincible and invincible. With his own strength, he repelled the diplomatic mission of the Qi kingdom and preserved the dignity of the Jing kingdom. He established the school of mathematics and started a new school of mathematics. He eliminated a large number of vermin in the court, the politics, economy, military, commerce, agriculture of the Jing kingdom. As long as Wei Xian could think of it, the shadow of jianghu of Silla could be seen. Because of this, he was trusted by the emperors of 2 dynasties. He became the youngest minister of the imperial court in history and the only foreign official in the history of the Jing kingdom to be conferred the title of prince. He had also reached the peak of what an official could achieve. Such a person should be valued by the emperors. However, due to various reasons, he left the capital city for 5 years. Wei Xian admired the jianghu of Silla very much. He even prostrated himself before him. Wei Xian admitted that the officials had wronged him. However, Shuzhou was the Jing kingdom Shuzhou, not the jianghu of Silla Shuzhou. He handed the name card to the concierge and said, "Please report that I, Wei Xian, request to meet the jianghu of Silla." Chapter 1168. The gatekeeper of the jianghu of Silla residence was especially busy today. Usually, only one person was needed to guard the door, but today there were 5 people on duty. Those who came to the residence today were either high-ranking officials or dignitaries. His Highness could afford to neglect them, but the gatekeeper could not. Hearing that the visitor reported his official title as Minister in Charge, one of the gatekeepers immediately became alert. He accepted the name card and stepped forward. "Sir, please come in." Today, some people who came to the jianghu of Silla residence would hand over their name cards and invitations according to the rules, but some people swaggered in, such as the old generals just now. They did not need to check the invitations one by one. In the entire capital, no one dared to freeload or cause trouble during the banquet of the jianghu of Silla residence. The gatekeeper led him through more than half of the residence, pointed to a courtyard in front and said, "This lowly one will escort you here, sir, can go in by yourself." Wei Xian took a deep breath and stepped in. Then he saw such a scene. Old General Ma pointed at Old General Shui's nose and scolded, "You old thing, there are only 2 drumsticks in total, and you actually want to monopolize them." Old General Shui had a drumstick in his mouth, but he was not to be outdone and scolded back. "Old thing, you still have the nerve to scold me? Just now, that jar of 30 years old wine was completely drunk by you. Did I say anything?" Old General Shui and Old General Ma were pointing at the sky and scolding each other. Right Prime Minister Dong Wenyun and Minister of Revenue Tseng Shichen clinked their glasses. The person lying under the table and being carried into the room was the capital governor, Lu Dayo. Minister of Justice Lu Yishui was serving dishes to the old generals. The 2 people in the innermost area should be the envoys of the Wu kingdom and the Qi kingdom. If he was not mistaken, the one squatting there grilling fish and crying because of the smoke was the Dean of the Divinity Academy, Prince Jin Lihan. From his angle he could see the kitchen. The figure bustling about in the kitchen was none other than Jianghu of Silla. Beside him were Princess Xianning and Princess Royal. Wei Xian did a rough count. More than half of the 20 members of the State Council were here. 1 Prime Minister, 2 ambassadors, 3 ministers and 4 old generals. In this small courtyard, more than half of the core forces in the imperial court of the Jing kingdom had gathered. "Hey, Lord Wei is here too. Why are you so late? Come sit here." Dong Wenyun's voice came from beside him. Wei Xian turned his head and was pulled to the table in a daze. He opened his mouth. "Prime Minister Dong?" Dong Wenyun smiled and said, "There's no Prime Minister Dong here and we're not talking about national affairs today." Li Xian picked up a piece of fish and looked at Li Yi. He suddenly said, "I plan to make Duanwu a princess. What do you think?" Hearing Duanwu's name, Li Han immediately pricked up his ears. Li Yi shook his head. "I don't have any objections. Duanwu and xuanhuan are a perfect match. However, she has the status of a princess. If she marries xuanhuan, others won't gossip about her." Li Xian looked at Li Han and asked, "Xuanhuan, you're going to be 18 soon. Brother plans to betroth Duanwu to you. It's time for you to fulfill your marriage with the Wang family. Why don't we do it together?" Li Han was overjoyed but his face was serious. It's all up to you, brother. Li Xian nodded his head and said, brother has to go out for a while. Zhe is too young to be the crown prince. As his uncle you should help him. Brother plans to let you be the regent for the time being. What do you think? Li Han picked up a piece of fish and almost dropped it on the ground. It turned out to be a multiple-choice question. Marry Xuanhu and Ling, or be regent? This was not a single-choice question. Either A and B choose at the same time or neither. Li Han took a deep breath and sighed. It's all up to you, brother. The officials in the courtyard didn't know that their emperor used a meal to change the structure of the Jing kingdom for the next few years or even more than 10 years. There are gains and losses. The current Prince Jin, the future Prince Regent, will regard this truth as the true meaning of life for a long time. The banquet ended earlier than Li Yi expected. Because of Li Xian, the officials present all took their leave after eating and drinking their fill. Li Yi stood in the courtyard side and said, why do you think the late emperor passed the throne to you? Li Xian looked depressed. I don't want to. A figure crawled out from under the table. He patted the dust on his body and bowed. This official greets your majesty in Jianghu of Silla. Li looked at him. This is Wei Xian, Minister of Revenue. Li Xian looked at him and said in surprise. You don't know the guest you invited? Li didn't know this Minister of Revenue. It was reasonable to say that a dignified Minister of Revenue shouldn't be here for a meal. Li looked at him and asked, Minister Wei, what's the matter? Today Wei Xian ate the chicken cooked by Jianghu of Silla and the fish roasted by Prince Jin. He also saw the many ministers and pillars of the court. Standing in this small courtyard and standing in the main hall was a completely different side. He also heard the conversation between His Majesty and Jianghu of Silla. This official admires His Highness Jianghu of Silla very much. He took a step back and bowed to Li Yi. I heard that His Highness is leaving. This official came uninvited to see His Highness off. I hope His Highness doesn't mind. Chapter 1169. Since the day the Crown Prince was born, the capital city had been immersed in jubilation. This kind of jubilation would probably last until the Lantern Festival. In the days before the Lantern Festival, the court was usually not in session, but this year there were many government decrees. The first was naturally the crowning of the Crown Prince, which was a major event related to the livelihood of the people. Then the court announced to the public that they would help the Zhao Kingdom, helping the Zhao Kingdom to resist the Qi Kingdom. The formal establishment of diplomatic relations with the Wu Kingdom. From then on, the two countries would be equal and mutually beneficial, which could be regarded as the third major event. Zhao Yi's plan failed, and Yang Yanzhou was about to return in vain. This time I'm afraid I can't see you off, brother Li. Yang Yanzhou would leave in 3 days and Li Yi would stay a few days longer than him. Li Yi looked at him and shook his head, saying, Isn't it good to stay obediently in your Qi Kingdom? Why do you have to go through so much trouble? Yang Yanzhou smiled and said, His Majesty often said that a person's life is only a short few decades. Once it's over you can't go back. Since that's the case, you might as well be bold, see the people you want to see, do the things you want to do, and live in this world not in vain. Why didn't Li Yi realize before that Zhao Yi had the potential to be a philosopher, and a chicken soup philosopher? However, that was his business. A queen lover was not qualified to laugh at an emperor lover. Zhao Yi was free to do whatever he wanted. He nodded and said, Then I wish him good luck. Yang Yanzhou nodded and said, Since His Majesty ascended to the throne, he has been working day and night and has been sick. He has caught a cold for several months and hasn't recovered. I hope Brother Li's auspicious words. Wei Liang left the second day after Yang Yanzhou's departure. Both the Wu Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom had just stabilized their regimes, but the two countries were walking in completely different directions. Zhao Yi wanted to strengthen the country through external expeditions, while Yang Liuqing wanted to take the path of stability and peace. This was also the plan that Li Yi had formulated for her from the beginning. By the time we left, the citizens of the country were almost completely loyal to His Majesty. When His Majesty entered the capital, some of the large clans in the capital provided great assistance. If not for that, we would not have been able to take down the capital so quickly. Wei Liang said. Then he shook his head and said, However, after His Majesty ascended to the throne, those large clans united and formed many constraints on His Highness. The Wu Kingdom was different from the Jing Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom. During the uprising in Yang Liuqing, he made use of the contradictions between the landlords and the peasants, and between the aristocratic families and the country gentry. Basically speaking, the interests of the aristocratic families were at stake. Under this historical background, It was impossible for those large clans that occupied a large amount of resources to be completely wiped out. There needed to be a balance between them, and this balance was not so easy to achieve. A few days ago, Li Yi had already received the news that Rui had gone to the Wu kingdom. After the matter in the capital was settled, they would first return to Rui city and stay for a few days before going to the Wu kingdom. Li Yi nodded and said, "In a few days I will go to the capital to take a look." A look of joy appeared on Wei Liang's face as he said, "That couldn't be better." After Wei Liang left, Li Yi also walked out of the small courtyard. Voices came from the roof. "Xiao Rui, I'm leaving soon. You have to miss me. Father said that when my brother grows up a little, I will be able to go and find you. How old will you be when you grow up a little?" "Oh my, very soon. In a month? At the very least I'll have to wait for a year. Ah, that's a long time." "It's a little long, but by then we will have already grown up. Why don't you marry me, then we won't have to be separated." "Okay." "What if Uncle Li doesn't agree?" Then we will elope." Li Yi did not know that the eldest young master of the Li family had already planned to elope with the eldest princess. He left the prince's mansion and went to the imperial palace. He and Emingzu stood in front of a palace. This was an independent palace, surrounded by a high outer wall, forming an enclosed courtyard. In fact, there were not many people living in the imperial palace. Li Xian and the others lived in Hibiscus Garden, so did the Empress Dowager and old princess. The other concubines of the former emperor were also arranged by Li Xian to live in other courtyards. The imperial palace had become a cage. And this palace was a cage within a cage. Naturally, there would be prisoners in the cage. "Let me out, you traitors, traitors. Save me, where are the imperial guards? Come and save me. Open the door for me, I want to go to the imperial court. The imperial court cannot do without me, the Jing kingdom cannot do without me." This was a voice that Li Yi had almost forgotten. When the king of Shu was captured, he pretended to be crazy. Li Xian kept him here so he did not have to worry about food and drink. Every once in a while he would send some books in to relieve his boredom, but he was not allowed to step out of the palace. This palace door, except for a small hole at the bottom for delivering food and other things, had not been opened for a long time. Li Emingzi looked at a eunuch in front and said, "Open the door." "Yes. I may not be able to do what I promised you in the past. Also, I admit that you are very wise, but you really gave birth to a silly son. But your daughters are all very good," Li muttered to himself as he continued to drink. Before he knew it, he had finished the remaining half of the jar of wine. He was drunk and leaned on the table murmuring, "Usually no one dares to bring wine here. This time you can drink to your heart's content. In the future I will try to visit you once a year. Don't kick me in my sleep again." Chapter 1170. After the Upper Yuan dynasty, there was no festive atmosphere in the capital. Everything remained the same. Many things happened at the beginning of the year, such as the birth of the crown prince, the establishment of diplomatic relations between Jing and Wu, and the resistance against Qi to aid Zhao. This should be the most eventful beginning of the year for the Jing kingdom in recent years. The cold of spring had not passed, and the sky had just brightened. There were already many vendors who had woken up early on the streets of the capital. The vendor who sold breakfast exhaled and rubbed his hands vigorously. He said, "The business is still good during the new year. One day is equivalent to half a month's business. It would be great if the new year was celebrated every day." The butcher who was 10 feet away mocked him, "Then why do you have a stall? Go home and hug your wife while dreaming. Every day is the new year. Give me 2 steamed buns and a bowl of porridge." A man who had woken up early for work turned his head to look at the butcher and said, "Don't forget to leave 2 caddies of lean meat stuffing for me today. I'll make dumplings at home tonight." The butcher waved his hand and said, "I didn't forget to make dumplings on the 1st and 15th day of the new year. This strange rule of yours hasn't changed in the past few years." The man smiled and said, "We were poor a few years ago. Now we have to eat back all the money we owe." The butcher said while cutting the meat, "Then you should eat meat every day." The man took a bite of the bun and said vaguely, "If the people in the capital ate meat every day, the happiest person would be you, Butcher Zheng." It was really hard to do business in the past few years. There were wars every day and the people didn't have much money left. We couldn't even sell the steamed buns. The vendor who sold breakfast added. The man drank a mouthful of porridge and said coldly, "It's all because of that mother * King Qi kingdom. Why can't they know their place? In the past they teamed up with the Zhao kingdom to fight us and now they're fighting the Zhao kingdom. They even beat their own people." Butcher Zheng chopped the meat and said, "It's all thanks to His Highness Jiang of Silla's heavenly punishment." Otherwise I'm afraid we'd still be bullied. Sigh, I heard that His Highness returned to the capital a few days ago. I wonder if he'll leave this time. With His Highness not in the capital, there hasn't been a big event in the capital for years. Let's go. The man finished his breakfast and left behind a few copper coins. He wiped his mouth and said, 2 days ago when I passed by the gate of the jianghu of Silla's manor, the main gate of the manor was already closed. His Highness has probably already left Jingdo. There are still so many playboys in the capital. Zheng Tufu sighed and murmured, why did His Highness leave? In Hibiscus Garden, Li Xian held his son in his arms and swayed left and right. He also sighed and said, they leave just like that every time. 3 small figures ran over from afar. In the front was a little girl about 5 or 6 years old. She hugged his arm and said, Father, Father, I want to learn martial arts. Li Xian nodded and said, Learn. As long as your mother agrees, Imperial Father will also agree. Mother has agreed. The little girl smiled and said, I'll go find Aunt Mingzu. After saying this she seemed to remember something and murmured, Aunt Mingzu is no longer in Jingdo? Then I'll go find little Aunt. Oh, little Aunt eloped with the prince consort. Li Xian looked at her in surprise and said, eloped? Who taught you that? The little girl rolled her eyes and said, Little Aunt said that when you leave with someone you like, it's called eloping. After saying this she didn't wait for Li Xian to ask any questions and quickly ran away. Li Xian shook his head and stopped thinking about this matter. He lowered his head to look at the sleeping child and whispered, Zay, you have to grow up quickly. In another part of Hibiscus Garden, 2 young girls walked hand in hand on the grass, chatting about something with smiles on their faces. Li Han held the kite string and followed behind the 2 of them. The corners of his mouth couldn't help but curl up. However, when he thought of something, the corners of his mouth couldn't help but curl up and turn into a bitter smile. In the military academy, a group of young people wearing thin clothes were swimming in the mud. Old General Shui stood at the side, holding a long whip in his hand and waving it from time to time. He then passed the whip to old General Ma beside him. In a restaurant in Jingdo, Tsing Shichen, Lu Daio and Lu Yi sat by the window. In another corner of the restaurant, a white-haired middle-aged man was drinking by himself. Beside him, a tall and sturdy man was making the woman singing in the restaurant giggle. In a shop not far from the restaurant, a fat man with bruises on his face pointed at a few workers and said unhappily, in the future, treat the customers like they are your wives and coax them. How do you coax your wives at home? How do you coax customers here? In a royal cemetery outside the city, a bearded young man waved a hoe and painstakingly cleared the weeds around a lone grave. In the Zhao Kingdom. 3 days ago, the imperial city of the Zhao Kingdom had been besieged by the army of the Qi Kingdom. 10 miles away from the imperial city, tents were erected one after another. Although it was night time, the tents were still brightly lit. Soldiers patrolled the area from time to time. The commander's tent in the center of the tents was completely dark. Coughing sounds could be heard from a small, inconspicuous tent. In front of Zhao Yi was a map. A city was drawn on the map. He had already circled a few of the city gates in red. A general looked at him and said worriedly, Your Majesty, Lord Yang has sent news that reinforcements from the Jing Kingdom will arrive in half a month. Zhao Yi opened his mouth but no sound came out. His coughing became even more intense. Someone looked at him and couldn't help but say, Your Majesty, it's getting late. You better get some rest. We'll discuss this matter tomorrow. Zhao Yi covered his mouth and coughed for a while. Then his breathing gradually calmed down. He clenched his fist and waved his hand. In a slightly hoarse voice he said, Pass down my order. Tomorrow we attack the city. Yes, Your Majesty. Several generals in the tent shouted and half knelt on the ground at the same time. After everyone had left the tent, Zhao Yi unclenched his fist and stared blankly at the trace of blood on his palm. In the Wu Kingdom. It was late at night. In an even more serene hall in the depths of the imperial palace. The crown that symbolized the emperor had been worn for a long time was a little heavy. Yang Liuqing was still not used to it. She took it off and put it aside. Then she opened another booklet. She flipped through it and saw that it was the same content as before. Then she threw it aside. If those people still don't know what's good for them, I'll teach them a lesson myself. An old voice came from a corner of the hall. Yang Liuqing shook her head and said, In fact, what they said is not unreasonable. The old man looked surprised. You. Yang Liuqing stood up and walked into the hall. Then she said, In any case I'll still pass the throne in the future. The next emperor of the Wu Kingdom must also have the bloodline of the Yang family. The old man was gloomy for a moment and asked, Among those people they proposed, is there anyone you like? Yang Liuqing shook her head. The old man lowered his head and seemed to be thinking about something. A figure appeared in his mind with a slightly angry expression. Bastard, you were so active at that time. Where have you gone now? This dress is very nice. A voice suddenly rang out in the hall. Xuanhuan's hair stood on end. He suddenly looked in a certain direction. The next moment he breathed a sigh of relief. Then the expression on his face became even more shocked. You've broken through? Yang Liuqing's face lit up. She hurried over and said, Master. Chapter 1171. It took him more than half a month to return to Shuzhou from the capital city. Mainly in consideration of the two old ladies' health, Li Yi deliberately slowed down. He would rather take a long detour than take the dangerous mountain path. It was just after the Lantern Festival when he left. When he arrived in Shuzhou it was almost April. Rui, Li Mu, and Li Jin accompanied the two old ladies. Xianning would not leave this time. Yongning was naturally happy. Li Duan was also very happy because Xianning spoiled him the most. His closeness to Xianning must have been established since she took care of him when he was a child. Whether it was the capital city or other places, Li always felt very depressed. As for Shu Prefecture and Rui City, they stood among the rolling mountains. Looking into the distance, they felt that every breath of air they breathed was free. He began to understand Li Xian a little. In addition to being more shameless than him, Li Xian also longed for freedom more than him. In April, the mountains were already covered with lush greenery. Li Yi stood at the peak and looked down. Amidst the lush greenery of the mountain, there were light-colored ribbons that stretched far into the distance. It was a wide cement road that connected all the mountains. It was also the most important mountain path in the fringe lands. What are you thinking about, my husband? A soft voice came from behind him. Li Yi turned around and saw Rui standing there. He had an illusion that Rui seemed to be standing there the whole time. Whether he was in Qing and Prefecture, the capital city, the Qi Kingdom, or the Wu Kingdom, it seemed that there was always a figure standing behind him. He could see her as soon as he turned around. Lying on the grass, Li Yi put his hands behind his head and said, I had a dream last night. I dreamed that one day when I woke up, I was in another place. Sitting beside him, Rui bent her legs and asked, What kind of place was it? Li Yi thought for a moment and said, A very large library surrounded by bookshelves. The bookshelves were filled with books that could not be finished in a lifetime. When I woke up, you, Rui, and Xuanhuan were not beside me. It was as if I was a person from another world and everything here was just a dream. In fact, Li Yi often had such a dream. He often woke up in the middle of the night and couldn't sleep anymore. Putting her hand on his head, Rui gently pressed it and said, You must be too tired, my husband. I have been here the whole time. Li Yi held her hand and said, What if I really came from another world? Looking down at him, Rui said, My husband came from another world. Actually, I have something that I have been hiding from you. She took a deep breath as if she had made a big decision. Looking at Li Yi, she said seriously, Actually, I am a fairy from heaven. I accidentally fell into the mortal world and lost my mana. Li Yi was startled. After staring at her for a long time, he suddenly sat up and pushed her down on the grass. Smiling, he said, Is that so? My wife is a fairy. Then I want to see how a fairy from heaven is different from a woman in the mortal world. Rui was a grandmaster. Li Yi couldn't beat her, but when he teased her, she was just a weak woman. This was different from Rui. After a while, her breathing became a little rapid. She moved away from Li Yi's hand and said hurriedly, My husband, don't make trouble. Li Yi rested his head on her lap and said, Fortunately, I didn't run away the night Rui took me up the mountain. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to marry such a fairy wife. Rui looked at him and said in surprise, You wanted to run away at that time? Of course I do. Li Yi nodded and said, I didn't know you were such a fairy at that time. What if you were a man with a face full of fat and weighed 200 pounds? I might as well die. Rui combed her slightly messy hair and asked with interest, Then why didn't you run away later? Were you subdued by my beauty? Do you want to hear the truth or a lie? Rui thought for a while and said, Lie first. Lie. Li Yi looked at her and said, Of course I found out that you were such a peerless beauty. I was subdued by your beauty. When you opened the door and came in, I even thought of the names Duaner and Xiaomu. That's a lie. Rui looked at him with a smile. She moved her hand away from his head and put it on his waist. She asked, What's the truth? Feeling the movement on his waist, Li Yi smiled and said, What truth? What I said just now was the truth. It couldn't be more true. He immediately felt a pain on his waist. Rui looked at him and said, If you don't say it, you can sleep with Sister Emingzu or Sister Wanru tonight. Of course not. Emingzu and Wanru hadn't entered the room yet. They definitely wouldn't let him enter the room. Although Rui usually didn't fight for anything, Ruoqing and Zuemo would definitely listen to her, not to mention Xiaohuan. Li thought for a while and said, "Actually, I wanted to wait for you to come in, knock you out and then run. But then you smashed the solid wooden table with a single slap." Li was still a little scared when he thought about it. "If I ran at that time, would you hit me?" "Yes." Rui nodded without hesitation and said, "I would still do it now." There was no good result from telling the truth. Every once in a while, Li would be able to come up with a famous saying. Women only wanted to listen to good things regardless of whether they were true or not. This was like how they could say they weren't beautiful, that their faces were thick, and that their buttocks were round, but men definitely couldn't go along with what they said. Otherwise they would be courting death. Lies would always be rewarded with erotic rewards. If he told the truth, he would be beaten. Rui had been violent for so many years, and she began to learn Rui's gentleness. Rui had been gentle for so many years, and she began to learn Rui's violence. Li felt that he might have discovered a theorem. Between sisters, the theorem of gentleness never changes, or the theorem of violence never changes. Gentleness wouldn't disappear out of thin air, nor would it appear out of thin air. It could only be transferred from one sister to another, and the total amount would always remain the same. The same was true of violence. How to find the balance between them was a problem that he needed to study in depth in the next few years, decades, or even decades. He was also puzzled by another question. Why was it that when Rui was violent, not only did he not hate it, but he would feel a kind of pleasure in his heart? This might be a kind of self-comfort, out of a human sense of self-protection. After all, there were already 3 grandmasters in his family, Rui, and Emingzu. In this life, no matter what, even if he became a grandmaster, he would not be able to make a comeback. If he couldn't change the reality, then he would change himself. If he couldn't resist, then he would enjoy it. As for why he liked this kind of Rui, it was because this kind of Rui was more real. This was not the awakening of his masochism, this was love. Li rubbed his buttocks and Rui used his arm as a pillow. Suddenly she said, "Husband, let's go to find Rui." Shuzhou Jiang of Sila's mansion. Li Duan skipped into a room and soon ran out. He held a piece of paper in his hand, ran to third Miss Chin, who had just walked into the yard, and said in panic, "Grandma, bad news, father and mother eloped." Chapter 1172. In the room, Xianning rubbed Li Duan's head and said, "They didn't elope. They went to find Aunt." Li Duan was relieved and murmured, "I thought father and mother didn't want me and Xiaomu and Xiaojin anymore." Xianning comforted him and then bent down to look at him. She asked, "Now can you tell me who taught you to elope?" Li Duan was startled and ran outside, but Xianning grabbed his ear. Xianning pinched his face and said, "You're so young. You should learn to elope. Didn't Xiaonyang elope with father? You even learned to talk back. Is your butt itching again?" Li Duan covered his ears and his heart sank. Xiaonyang changed. Xiaonyang was no longer the Xiaonyang who bought him candies. How did Xiaonyang change? It seemed that he couldn't tell Xiaonyang about eloping with Xiao Rui, but he could tell Xiaomu. Xiaomu was still young and didn't even know what eloping was. He didn't need to be afraid of others knowing, and he didn't need to keep it to himself. Xianning slapped Li Duan's butt a few times and told him to study hard and practice martial arts. Then she went to another yard. Emingzu sat in the study and opened an envelope. Xuning walked in. Seeing that she was reading carefully, he stuck his head out to take a look. This letter was a spy from the imperial court. The Jing kingdom sent 30,000 soldiers and 100,000 soldiers from the Zhao kingdom to the imperial capital of the Zhao kingdom as reinforcements. This time, the emperor of the Qi kingdom led 300,000 soldiers. Of course, this 100,000 soldiers were not enough. However, there were still more than 100,000 soldiers in the imperial capital of the Zhao kingdom. With the help of Tian Fa, they didn't need to fear the Qi kingdom. This letter arrived today, which meant that they had been in the imperial capital of the Zhao kingdom for at least a month. The next letter should be the news of victory. She sat down at the desk and said, "Royal sister, we're already here. Why are you still reading these things?" This time the Jing kingdom supported Zhao against Qi, not because the Jing kingdom had nowhere to use its power, nor was it a whim of the imperial court. It was a decision made after much consideration. This involved a series of political and interest factors, and to a large extent, it would change the structure of the countries in the next few decades. However, Xiaoning would not understand these things. She put down the letter and asked, "Aren't you teaching Yongning martial arts?" Why is she here again? Xiaomu pestered her to go play on the slide. Shanning took the letter and looked at it. She shook her head and said, "When will Xiao Rui come?" "It's more lively when there are more people." May of the 5th year of Jinghe. It was the end of spring and the beginning of summer, one of the most pleasant months of the year. In May, not only did the warm wind of early summer sweep across the land, but there was also a thunderous news. In the lotus garden of the Jing kingdom, when Li Xian woke up from his afternoon nap, he found several old generals standing in front of the palace with solemn expressions. In the Wu kingdom, the imperial court meeting had just ended. The officials walked out of the main hall, their faces still filled with disbelief. A month ago, the capital of the Zhao kingdom, Qiang, was conquered by the Qi kingdom. The civil and military officials in the imperial city, including the king of the Zhao kingdom, were all captured. The reinforcements, including the 30,000 elites of the Jing kingdom, were all captured, except for those who died in battle. It was said that the Qi kingdom soldiers suffered great losses because of the heavenly punishment of the Jing kingdom during the battle. However, not long after the two armies started fighting, the sunny weather suddenly became overcast with dark clouds. Sand and pebbles flew everywhere, followed by heavy rain. The heavenly punishment lost its power, and the army of the Qi kingdom turned the tide in a short period of time, winning the Battle of Qiang. Thus, the Zhao kingdom was destroyed. In the Jing kingdom, the morning court meeting, which had not been held for many days, had lasted for several hours today. The army of the Jing kingdom, which had been invincible and had created many legends, had suffered a setback for the first time in these years. The soldiers and generals who were captured by the Qi kingdom were a problem that needed to be dealt with. The defeat of this battle was also very important. A civil official said with great regret, "This is an unfavorable time. If it weren't for the heavenly punishment, our army would have been defeated." *T. Old General Shui did not care that this was the court meeting. He pointed at his nose and scolded, "Is the Jing kingdom's army only relying on heavenly punishment?" Old General Ma was so angry that his beard was trembling. He pointed at his nose and shouted, "The Qi kingdom has 300,000 soldiers. That's an army of 300,000 soldiers, not 300,000 pigs." With heavenly punishment, the Jing kingdom had obtained countless victories in the past few years. This caused most people in the court to forget how powerful the Qi kingdom was in the past. The strength of the country and the strength of the army allowed them to crush and humiliate the Jing kingdom for decades. Although heavenly punishment had given the Jing kingdom a few years to turn around, the Qi kingdom was still the Qi kingdom. They had not become weaker. Without heavenly punishment, the Jing kingdom would not have much of an advantage against the Qi kingdom. Moreover, this time they were fighting against the Qi kingdom's 300,000 soldiers with only 100,000 soldiers.